Hi, everyone. As we continue to look at the story of the plagues in Exodus, a big question that comes up is about all the people, right? Is it unfair that all the Egyptian people suffer because of Pharaoh's stubbornness and his choices, right? As they're suffering just collateral damage in this fight between so-called gods, right? Yahweh, the God of Israel, and Pharaoh, who thinks he's a god. Well, the first response to that question is to recognize that we're asking an individualist kind of question to a collectivist culture, right? We, as Western Americans in the 21st century, think of everything in individual terms. And in the ancient world, both of the Old and New Testament, they thought of everything in terms of the community, right? And so it was much more common for them to think of national guilt or the guilt of a people, whereas we only can think about guilt of individuals, right? Even today, many of us still want to ignore systemic problems and systemic injustice and focus only on individual actions. But even this question of, are the Egyptians innocent? Well, Exodus makes clear that they're not. If you go back to the very beginning in chapter 1, when it talks about them, the Hebrews being enslaved, it says, they, the Egyptians, they were ruthless. They made their lives miserable. They forced them to do cruel work. Pharaoh himself says, one of the points when he seems to be repentant, but he's really not, says, I and my people are in the wrong. Right? All of the Egyptians, at some level, enforced and benefited from Hebrew slavery. So they're not as innocent as we might think. Maybe some of this is personal. Maybe as a nation that enslaved a group of people, we have our own reasons for shying away from any sort of corporate responsibility. The wealth and even some of the buildings that Black people in America created still exists. And who owns most of it? You see, I think we can believe that guilt is primarily individual, and yet there are often consequences of sin that go beyond the sinner. I think Exodus later is going to point to this when God kind of gives this defining characteristics of himself in chapter 34. It talks about God both forgiving to thousands of generations, but also not holding sins against 3 or 4 generations. They're punishing for 4 generations. It doesn't seem to make much sense, right? How can God be forgiving and then hold it against people? But I think it is pointing towards this, right? That sometimes there's consequences to sin, even if there is forgiveness. And so that's what we're seeing here played out, is everyone is facing the consequences of this because in some sense they were complicit. And yet, with all this, as we read scripture through the lens of Christ, that should make us question whether God solves problems with violence. And to me, the answer is no. Right? The clearest picture of divine salvation and love is Christ sacrificing himself on the cross. It's God absorbing our violence, not causing it or putting it on people. It's God offering his firstborn instead of killing theirs. And so this is the bigger move of Scripture that we have to see, is the movement towards nonviolence, and yet seeing that there is consequences to the violence that we cause. It's a mystery. Maybe I've explained it well, maybe not. But I hope it gives you something to think about today.